Greetings, everyone. Welcome to Macro Social Work Stories. On today, we have a guest who's going to talk about the equity work that she's completing. She's a professor in Tennessee, and we're going to talk about the work that she's doing as she look at issues in Southeast states, utilizing transdisciplinary and frameworks to conduct research. She collaborates with engineers, city government officials, community organizations to address social and build human environments. We know that environmental inequities, environmental issues plague different vulnerable and resilient populations. So we're going to talk about the work that she's doing. Dr. First has been published in leading science journals, featured in national and international media outlets, and supported by grants by the TVA. She's connected in communities, natural hazards, Center Weather Program Office, so emergency disaster, all those various things as relates to our environment. We know that our environment impacts the quality of life. And my colleague, Dr. Christy Holmes, also is in that area. And so we're going to have a delightful, engaging conversation with our guest, Dr. Jennifer First. So welcome, Dr. First, to Macro Social Work Stories.
Great. Thank you so much. It's wonderful to be here.
Thank you for
Excited to have you.
Yes.
Thank you.
One of our first questions that we ask our guests is, that's a fun fact, as you tell us a little bit about yourself, a fun fact.
Okay, sure. That's the one I have to think the most about. Funny enough. So what comes to mind, a fun fact, is I live in a household full of boys and men, I guess. So I have a small son who is 9 years old, Oliver. I have a husband, Nathan, and then I have a Norwegian Elk-Hound dog, Timber, who just walked in and is joining us. So,
Yes.
Yay!
Yes, a lot of activity going on in your home.
Yes.
A lot of activity, responsibility.
Realities of working at home.
Yes, yes. And so, as you look at your journey, your social work journey, tell us a little bit about how you began your path that led you into the career of social work.
Sure. Thank you for that question. Yes. So my journey into social work, I began my MSW back in 2008 or 9. And I was focused actually on clinical social work. So I was really interested in the impacts that traumatic events have on individuals. And every time I was in a class, everyone always said to me, I think you're back row. So every approach that I took, I mean, very much was, well, let's talk about the larger systems and how they impact individuals. And so, but I really wanted to study trauma. So that's why I went the clinical route. But then so I did my master's degree at University of Missouri. I'm from St. Louis. And in 2011, while I was finishing up my master's degree, we had in the city of Joplin, Missouri, a major EF5 tornado, one of the most deadly tornadoes in US history. And I was a part of doing some work there. And that was kind of my first initial aha kind of click moment of, I want to study the collective impacts and collective trauma following extreme weather events or other types of disaster events. And so after that, then I really, so in social work, I thought, well, what kind of job could I find there? And actually it was, things just kind of came together. There was a center that was being established in Missouri called the Disaster and Community Crisis Center. And so I began working there as a mental health program manager. They were a part of a larger, the National Child Traumatic Stress Network. So had the opportunity to look at how individuals, families, and communities from around the United States are impacted by disaster events. And then this led me to getting, so kind of the boots on the ground work, and then really getting interested in research. And so I went on to get my PhD, and my research focused area is specifically on climate change. the human impacts of climate change and extreme weather events. And so, yeah, that's a little bit about my journey in terms of social work, macro social work, obviously large issues like climate change and how it impacts our communities are very much at the macro level. We know disproportionately these events impact marginalized and populations who are already on the margins of society. So they bear the brunt when these events happen. They, in terms of they are often don't receive warnings, they often aren't prepared, they haven't been given the resources, and then after events happen, encounter things like discrimination, also bear more stressors. So we just see overwhelmingly that it should be inequalities at work.
Yeah, there's so much to unpack there. Dr. Holmes, I know that you are involved in disaster relief. And so what are some things that you would like to ask Dr. first?
Well, I was just thinking, experience-wise, those who are left in the shelters at the end are pretty much who you're recognizing right now, the ones who are marginalized to start with. Often there's a lot of casework to be done at the tail end of sheltering, at least before it moves into any sort of recovery phase. And I was noticing your background when I was reading before we started. So you've moved around to a few different states. How have you seen it vary as far as response, even politically? How has it been for you working in this area as a social worker? I'm very impressed that you do this. I hope that more people want to do this after hearing you speak today, because we need a lot more social workers in this area, whether it's macro, meso, micro, across the board, right? But yeah, your experience, I just want to know more about your experience in the different states and if politically it impacted you this last couple of years, especially.
Oh, interesting question. So yes, I did much of my kind of community work, and I did my academic work in Missouri. And in terms of just a wealth of kind of extreme weather events is there. I then went to Maine actually for a year after I graduated and took a job in Maine, and was much more connected to the thinking about climate change. So there was an institute in Maine, the Climate Change Institute. And so really connecting with climate scientists, it afforded that opportunity. I would say, so when you ask about politically, I haven't really encountered, in terms of my research or my work, any major barriers there. So I was in Maine for a year, and then a job opened up at University of Tennessee in Knoxville. And it was a great position. So I took that, and I'm excited to be here. And I really think the Southeast is just where I have found kind of a connection on so many levels. So not just thinking about these acute disaster events, that happen, they begin and end, but really also thinking about slower moving events, thinking about extreme heat and how that impacts so where I'm at in Knoxville, Tennessee, just looking at different parts of our city, how our environments have been built, how issues like redlining, so historical racism, how that has continued to impact how our cities have been built, the housing infrastructure that is there. And so that's a project that I'm working on right now with a lot of different individuals in the community and other researchers here. But looking at how different areas in the city are hotter and how we can connect those to historical inequalities and those that have continued to continue into current. So yeah, in terms of just different states, I'd say the biggest difference obviously is the climate and weather, and they each have their unique sort of factors. And I would say the Southeast, definitely seeing an area of, in December we had across the Midwest and Southeast these major tornado events, quad state tornado events. And that's common in this area, meaning, we get these large clusters of tornadoes that happen, and they extend beyond the spring into the winter months, and they happen at night. So we have nocturnal tornadoes, and they're much more deadly because people are asleep. They might not see. So really just thinking about kind of where we live, I guess, to connect all of this to social work and macro social work, to really think about making that connection to, we talk, social justice is our, as our profession, that's what we, are mandated, what we are here to do. And to also think about, and I talk about this with my students, I teach macro social work, but to also connect to spatial justice. So thinking about, these our social systems set up space, but to really think about kind of, how it plays out in time and space in different ways. So, so I hope I answered your question. Sorry.
He can tell you love what you do. I love that you're able to also connect the dots for social workers listening, that there's a place. And I know I'm sure you fell in love with research and all of this. And there's a place for the MSW level as well. Could you talk a little bit about, I think that's probably our biggest group that will be listening as far as looking as to what career to go into. Do you have any suggestions for MSW level social workers who maybe don't want to just do clinical work? I definitely support them doing volunteer work for Red Cross or something like that. But as far as a job where they actually get paid, suggestions for them?
Absolutely. So in terms of thinking about social work profession and both macro and micro profession, I think there is a large need for social workers who can make that connection to environmental justice issues, climate justice issues. We need advocates. And I think what social work really brings to the table that we don't see in other professions is this focus on social justice and the ability to make connections in the community, to advocate and think about things, again, from just a multiple perspectives. So that the person and environment perspective is really beneficial. And in terms of jobs, so I think that we're going to see, we're already seeing many more communities that are recognizing this is a major issue. This is not going away. And actually this is becoming, and people are realizing, kind of one of our most important issues is our, planet. And so in terms of jobs, different organizations who have an environmental focus, I would also say that you already mentioned in terms of nonprofits who actually go into communities and do relief work or recovery work following major events. So I guess I would say breaking it down into a couple areas, which would be kind of that post-recovery area. That's where social workers are seen the most, doing things like case management, like you mentioned, also mental health support. And then the other areas I would say is social workers who are interested in environmental justice and climate justice. They can connect then to environmental agencies that are doing that work. And then the final area that I would say is just mental health in general. I feel like climate, we're seeing in terms of, eco-anxiety, climate related sort of mental health issues that we're seeing are increasing. So I think if we're doing any sort of mental health work, that this would be an important area to really think about and make connections to potentially how you could then help your clients. So I guess it would be those kind of three main areas. Great questions.
Yes.
Well, I have a follow-up to that one, because given the last 2 years, whether or not this pandemic's over or on pause, something else is likely to come in future, being as hopeful as possible about that, along with disasters. So we saw them coming at the same time, so side by side. Did you have any experience or do any research, anything comment-wise on seeing two things happening at once? I know even the shelters were having, issues earlier on in the pandemic during disasters because of, safety and masking, and which just added to the pressure for everyone, right? So any experience with that, or what you think for future, having the dual issue of a pandemic and disaster at the same time?
Absolutely. Dr. Holmes, I can tell that you have spent work in this area because that is such a great question. And yes, absolutely. And again, you're right in tune with what I think are the things that we need to be creating the most awareness about, which is we're going to be seeing much more, as you mentioned, they're classified and called different things, but multi-hazards, compound hazards, really this ability to think about dual things happening. And so, yes, we saw this, obviously the pandemic, and basically what makes these kinds of events the, most challenging is when they, what we do to stay safe kind of compete against one another. And so the examples you gave, so if you needed to evacuate from your home or from your community and go to a shelter, a public shelter during a pandemic, then those protective actions kind of compete against one another because you're placing yourself then. Well, I'm actually, so it's funny you said that because I'm just working on, before this call, another study that we're doing that's looking at that, but related to two hazards that we have in the Southeast. We have tornadoes that overlap with flash flooding. And when you think about those events happening and what the public has to do, the warnings that go out are if a tornado is happening, you need to get below ground and the flash floods. And then you get a warning that says get to higher ground. And so it really creates this confusion and uncertainty for the public on what they're supposed to do. And those that actually are most kind of in harm's way are the socially vulnerable. So individuals who live in housing so mobile homes, which would require them to say evacuate their home and drive through, to get to safety.
Right.
So
turn around, don't drown once you get on the road.
Yes. So that's exactly, so to bring it back to what you're saying, these are the things we're going to see more and more of. And these are the things that, this is an area that social workers can be involved in. Again, I can't think of professions that know how to work in kind of multiple environments. And again, I think at the heart of all of this is thinking about who is most vulnerable or who has been made most vulnerable. And to think about that in every community, we come at this from, we either provide resources for people to adapt or we withhold them. And so to really kind of have this perspective of that lens and trying to make those changes. And we can only make those changes through collaborations, which is macro social work. So.
Yes. Collaboration is vital as we look at these compounding matters in our society. I was reading a post by Dr. Beth Daughtery on on social media previously in preparing for our time together. And she was saying that she had opportunity to speak to her students. And you talked about redlining, poverty, and COVID, and how all those three things impacted the same different areas systematically, those who are oppressed and vulnerable quite differently. And you can pinpoint and see how redlining, poverty, and COVID impact those who are vulnerable populations, and what we can do to, like you said, decide to provide support or refrain from it. And one of my, mentors from afar, he talked about the difference between charity and social justice. And many times charity is giving someone fish. But he told the story of how this church was near a hill, And so the church wanted to provide services because so often these individuals would get into accidents when they come to the hill. They were getting car accidents when they ride to the hill. And so the church decided to purchase an emergency ambulance vehicle. And so he said, that's charity.
Mhm.
But what if we put rails so that people are not injured? And so as social workers, we have to progress past charity
Mhm.
and look at social justice where it can actually bring about change for environments that our society created for vulnerable populations to reside in,
Mhm.
areas that we know have a high risk of flooding, that we sell
Right.
homes cheaper, what our families can afford, or near the jobs that they have access to. A lot of these things are set up for our society members, and trying to be positive.
Mhm.
How would you talk about bringing about either one about change
Mhm.
as we look at social work month, social work awareness month, and
Mhm.
the things that we have to do as social workers to progress?
Mhm.
Because many times social workers have been on the wrong side of the social justice picture.
Mhm. Absolutely, Dr. Jones. Um, so, in terms of, I think you gave just in terms of thinking about working in communities and what social work has done, in the past, and being on the wrong side, and distinguishing ourselves from charity. So, setting it up, I absolutely agree. Setting up systems where, again, we are withholding. We choose whether, when, and how we give, as opposed to building in the community on the capacities that already exist and making it sustainable. So for the long run, that we then aren't the gatekeepers to, in terms of thinking about improving a system. So I think that making those changes, I absolutely agree that so we talk about social justice, but really thinking about it from the framework that you're saying, um, where it is equitable, sustainable, and it's done in concert with and connection to individuals that live in these communities, and working with. So it's on every level, it's macro social work. I mean, you cannot do this in isolation. Um, and I so agree with you in the sense it's an interesting, so when we think about disaster events, the definition is like it overwhelms the community. So people from the outside have to come in and support. But then when they leave and they pull up the tents and they leave,
Right.
there's still the problems are still there. And the system, even our own government system has been found, it's been documented, to be set up to benefit white middle class individuals in terms of disaster recovery. And so again, it's looking at the different systems and changing those, and in terms of also thinking about what you talked about, in terms of that connection of COVID and redlining, and in terms of thinking about how individuals were, in terms of health inequalities, these kind of overlapping compounding issues will continue to come up. So it absolutely is, making changes again, in connection to individuals that live in areas that are so making those across systems, really having, I think, this multi-system viewpoint. But again, it has to have that focus of social justice, and changing systems, so that they can be more equitable. So I agree, though, everything that you said it way better than I did. So.
Well, Dr. First, I was thinking when you said, and I wrote it down twice, compound hazards, and I heard you, Dr. Jones, too. You said I like the term because it's specific, and I kept thinking children when you're talking about vulnerable, and in a positive way. I live in Los Angeles. COVID, I feel like, has changed some things that we could not we said we could not do before, and then we did start doing when it became necessary, especially when it came to food for children in the LAUSD school district, which is like 800,000 kids here. And it switched from the whole reduced lunch, proving income and all of that to access services to forget it. We will just give it to everyone, reallocating funds. Something that could never have been done before suddenly was able to happen in COVID. And now the kids also can just now at school go get free lunch without question, without any sort of screening process. If you want to eat the food in the cafeteria. And how long has that been going on, federally? I know state by state they're doing different things, but on the positive side of it, I've seen some things happen that would never have happened before. They sent out pandemic EBT cards automatically to a lot of families they knew needed them. It could have gone further, but there are steps that have been taken that show us we don't actually have to create more hoops for families, especially in the communities we need to serve. And state by state or even local communities or school districts can handle some of these things. And so I think social workers have a place there that we don't really see ourselves to be able to change the system, right? So it isn't just the charity work, it's changing the system so that we don't have to deal with that in the same way. And we don't have to single people out either. But I have seen some positive changes happen suddenly, right? When someone just said yes and they changed the budget and they reallocated funds. And so we know it can happen now. And I think that social workers have enough numbers also to be better advocates for this. And I think Dr. First, you said that in your first minute about being advocates as far as a job. So finding a place that maybe doesn't say social work title, but stepping in is, I hope to see more of that.
Absolutely. And that's a great example. I mean, and, just in terms of thinking about the pandemic, I mean, we have been all living in kind of this collective disaster event and a slow moving disaster that will probably stay with us. But that example is a great one in terms of thinking about the different roles that social work can play. But advocacy is probably one of the largest. Absolutely.
Yes. As you highlighted the research, the vital research that you're doing, you and your team, of looking at climate injustice, as well as the information that's being emerging when looking at co-found or I guess two different factors working together. How is that information disseminated? We know that you have to work with policymakers as well as common individuals, and so different conversations happen. How do those conversations happen with your various key stakeholders that you have to meet with?
Good question.
That is a good question. So I can give you an example of a project right now that we're working on here in Knoxville, and so we're looking at urban heat islands in Knoxville. So urban heat islands are in urban areas, certain parts of an urban city that has less vegetation and trees. It kind of soaks up the heat. You can think about it if you're wearing, like a black shirt outside, literally soaking that up. But at nighttime in rural areas that don't have all of the asphalt that we have in an urban area, that can the overnight hours, then kind of that heat doesn't stay with as long. But in urban areas, and especially in these urban heat island areas, there's never that relief. And so that plays a big impact on people's health. And so this is an area that we're looking at is urban heat islands in Knoxville. And we're specifically focused on looking at inequalities. So as I mentioned, redlining is, we can trace specifically in our cities, where the infrastructure has not happened. What this does then is it's a health issue. It also creates more energy burden for the people that live in these areas. And again, this compounds with so you have more energy burden, and you're already on, say a fixed income, and you're deciding between being able to cool down your house or pay your rent, or be evicted. That's then coupled with the heat might really compound a health issue you might have, a health need. And so that further exacerbates that. You might not have health insurance. So again, just the sort of all of these things kind of coming together. And so getting back to your question on how does this work in terms of addressing these issues? So we created, it's called the Knoxville Heat Equity Coalition. It's essentially a task force that we've started actually in the past few months. And it's within that task force, we have city officials from different city offices. We have community advocates that are focused on climate justice. We have community members that live within neighborhoods who are impacted the most. And so we've come together. Our main focus is to bring about awareness in our community, but then also to, for those of us who are doing research, we're really wanting this, not to just look at things from our viewpoint, but kind of make that collaboration and collect kind of the different things that we can use then to say, we need to address these needs. And then come up with strategies that mitigate, so help prevent further heat inequalities, but then strategies to directly adapt, because we know it's just going to keep increasing, especially in the Southeast, but everywhere. So those conversations are really, it comes down, again, that's where social work, I cannot think of any other profession, because I work with so many other disciplines. I'm always looked at, me and my students are always looked at to bring the people together, to be honest. And that is something that I really think is an essential skill in this whole problem. So
well, part of this too, I feel like there was a program here in Los Angeles that we didn't know about. I was going to ask you about mitigation strategies, and you started going into that, but I was thinking about the tree. They have trees, like city tree program. And so you can sign up to go pick up free trees. Sometimes they're citrus or, native trees that do well in drought, that sort of thing. So you can just go pick up trees and plant them. But I found out about it in an indirect way. I don't remember how I found out about it. And I was like, why don't we know about this? And some of the things they're doing are, street medians to find ways to plant, bring the heat down and things like that. But I think part of that too is, I think, Gary, when you're asking about the communication, is like, how does it get out? I think it might have been a social media ad I saw it on, which that is a decent way of getting it. But are we getting the message to the people who really, really need it? I actually live in a very treed area. Does everyone get the same messaging? Is it set out equitably? I have doubts about that. And also, do they have some place to plant the tree if they're given a free tree? Are they even allowed to plant the tree or put it on their balcony or any of the other things that I think a lot of the people who do the planning don't think through? And I think that's where the social workers can come in as well and say, hey, that's a really nice idea, nice thought. It's not going to really work in the neighborhoods that really need it. We've got to think other ways of doing this. But I really appreciate that you're doing this work. And I'm thinking city councils might be a good place too, to bring up some of these issues, or have social workers showing up to bring everybody together so that we're addressing these on different levels.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And so as we wrap our conversation up on today, we want to give you the last word, Dr. First. We have emerging social workers. We have seasoned social workers, and they want to say, what can I do now? What can I do today? How can I take action with looking at the compound hazards that will continue to happen in our society? What are some things they could do as we hear your final thoughts?
Great, thank you. So in answering that question, I think of a couple of things. And because I work with students, and I'm thinking of kind of where they're at, and so a couple of things. The first thing that I think about is for individuals to think about, so future social worker professionals, to, if you're thinking about and you're really interested in climate change and climate justice, but you get overwhelmed, because many of my students do, in terms of where do I start, where do I begin? And I think that it really is about, you can do this in whatever kind of place that you're working. Again, if you're doing mental health, to really kind of make that connection to this, this is impacting people right now. And so to kind of look at different sort of therapy, or in terms of just wellness, on tools that you can give people to deal with if they're having, say, climate anxiety, also for yourself. So I always emphasize this, as much as you go out and are passionate about and advocate for individuals and communities and the climate, you have to do that for yourself as well. So I'm always saying that, especially during a pandemic, I just feel like so many of advocates are it's just so much, that we're taking in, and it can lead to people feeling very hopeless, honestly. So really to balance that with taking care of yourself, surrounding yourself with people that can support you, so that you can be an advocate for climate change. I think that you, in terms of making, again, these, whatever organization you're in, you can bring this up. If you're interested in doing sort of community level change, it really is about connections and building those, and bringing those up in different ways, whether it's at a city council meeting or establishing some sort of task force, but bringing people together, because you can't do it alone. And to always include individuals who are impacted the most and hear their voices. So I think that's it. Yeah.
Yeah. And thank you for noting the importance for collaboration and to reflect upon what our needs are as helping professionals, as we desire to bring about sustainable change. So often we're ready to jump to provide that service, and we're in harm's way. And so collaboration, reflecting about how I can be a better use in serving as relates to climate control and compound hazards, and the fact that we can serve on different levels, individual, the meso, and the macro, all at the same time. And so we all can bring about change as it relates to these inequities that will continue to happen in our society. And because of our society that we reside in, we're going to continue to have climate issues. And so we need to ask the hard questions. Are we selective on who we're going to serve and provide quality of life? Or does everyone deserve happiness, liberty, and justice in our society? So thank you, Dr. First, for this conversation. And we're going to continue these conversations with our different colleagues. So thank you. Thank you, everyone, for joining us.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for your time, Dr. First.
Thank you. So wonderful to be here. Thanks again. Bye.
See you later.
Bye. And we'll see you next time on Macro Social Work Stories.